Big 12 plays the truest schedule of any in the country, meaning that for me, it's the truest, most credible championship because everybody plays everyone. There's no discussion over, oh, well, they dodged these three teams and they had to play this gauntlet because they had to play everybody difficult in the other division. Nothing like that. Everybody plays everyone. I love the way the Big 12 setup is because of that. Doesn't cause for much debate because of what I just mentioned, but I'm looking for difficult stretches here, and I'm seeing Texas, TCU are back to back, and a lot of people are expecting TCU to bounce back and be a pretty good club this year. Then after the bye week in early November, stretch drive of at Baylor, Iowa State, and then at Oklahoma State to conclude. Those would be the two stretches that stand out to me at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at this as it published yesterday, those were the two very key stretches that I would see from an Oklahoma perspective. TCU is improved. Not sure what they'll have from a quarterback perspective next year. What that looks like. But yeah, the first one that you'd mentioned, specifically if you want to look at Kansas State and then Texas, obviously in the Cotton Bowl. At Kansas State, they beat Oklahoma the last 2 years. You have to think Oklahoma will have that one circled on their calendar very early. And I think it's maybe a little bit beneficial that Oklahoma has Kansas State and Texas back-to-back. So a lot of times you've seen over the years Oklahoma will have a game before Texas, and they're really focused on Texas, and maybe they're a little bit kind of lackadaisical in their effort against that team. So I think it's good that they'll have a team right there waiting for them. Waiting for them that will certainly have their attention. And then, as you mentioned, to close the year at Baylor, the one thing that's good, Oklahoma does have a bye week between, as you mentioned, between Texas Tech before they travel to Waco to play Baylor. So I think that will be important. Oklahoma, didn't play well against Baylor early on or late in the year this past year, but certainly came up with a victory. And then Iowa State at home. I think the Big 12 schedule makers, it's going to be either feast or famine with that game, right? So a lot of thoughts early on was that game would be kind of front-loaded on the schedule because both of those teams will be probably top 10 preseason, a top 10 preseason team. So it's kind of a feast or famine. You wait till the end of the year. Not sure what, obviously not sure what will happen with either of those teams. Still could be a top 5, top 10 matchup, but, should either of those teams, kind of hit a bump in the road, the game might lose a little bit of its luster there at the end. And then certainly Oklahoma ends the season back in a familiar territory, playing Oklahoma State around the Thanksgiving holiday. So again, Oklahoma has had Oklahoma State's number over the past few years. Mike Gundy has not been successful at all against Oklahoma. Oklahoma seems to play a lot better in that game. Oklahoma State seems to be a little closer to the vest. From a from a strategy perspective. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I think the schedule sets up for Oklahoma well to make a run, just in terms of they have a little bit of a tough stretch there in the beginning of October. Then they have a stretch where they're hosting TCU, they play at Kansas, hosting Texas Tech, and then so they get a little bit of a break in terms of the schedule there, and then it certainly heats up at the end of the season when you would hope that you're playing your best ball, and then certainly you'll have hopefully the Big 12 championship game at that point for Oklahoma. So it does set up in such a way that they have an opportunity early on to get some of these new faces acclimated to the team, and you playing specifically when you talk about some of the transfers and offensively getting that going as well. So I think it like I said, it does set up to give Oklahoma an opportunity to run the table, which is something they haven't done in quite some time. They haven't finished the season undefeated. So I think that's one of those things that's going to be looked at depending on when they lose and who they lose to, but I think it's pretty important for Oklahoma. The amount of momentum that they have this year coming into this season is, can they go through a season where they're undefeated going into that college football playoff?
If you just look at the conference schedule, if I'm not mistaken, if you go back to 2016, that would have been the year they lost to Ohio State and Houston, but then they won all the games in the Big 12 right, and were undefeated in the conference.
Yeah, that's right. You're absolutely right. And I think where I was going with that, just an overall non-conference plus conference finishing undefeated. But the thing that Oklahoma has seen over the last few years is every year they lose to a team that they're really not supposed to lose to. They've lost more games than any team in the country when they've been a 20-plus favorite. So I think that's the lesson learned that you could probably see, hopefully, come across this year from a concentrating, from an effort perspective, each day in and day out. It's hard. Kids aren't going to get up for every single game every weekend, but being able to avoid that upset is something that's been a bugaboo from a program perspective specifically since Riley has taken over.
Well, when you mentioned the difficulty of showing up every week and having your A game every week, and then that probability for not just Oklahoma, any top team, that somebody's going to jump up, somebody that's capable but under the radar, that would be, again, understandable, unless it was Kansas State again. As you mentioned off the top, that's the one that should be circled. They should be ready for that one.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I wouldn't imagine that they wouldn't be ready for that game. But I mean, I think, looking at a team that possibly could jump up and bite Oklahoma under the radar. I mean, Baylor looks like that could be an opportunity traveling there before, maybe their two biggest games. Certainly their biggest game at home against Iowa State. Looking at that, maybe a Texas or maybe a TCU is another one that you would think about that would be under the radar. But other than that, you got your big games: Texas, Iowa State, Oklahoma State. And I talked about this in one of my articles this week. Was really kind of previewing the schedule. Is Texas has a tougher schedule leading up to Oklahoma. They play Louisiana and Arkansas in the non-conference, but if they happen to come through that unscathed, we talked about whether or not me and you agree with this from a preseason perspective. Texas is very likely to be a top 10, top 15 team to start the season. So if they go through some of those teams unscathed and they're undefeated going into the Cotton Bowl, they are most certainly would be a top 10, if not the top 5 team by that time.
Good conversation as always with Jason Ray. Last word on college football. Jason, we appreciate you stopping by, and we'll talk some more recruiting, I'm sure, and get everyone set for spring practice. That's got to be coming up sometime in the next month, I would think.
Yeah, I think Oklahoma's starting in March. They pushed the spring game back just a little bit to late April, but I think they're getting started here in the March timeframe.
Sounds good. All right, Jason, appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Mark.